Okay, good morning and welcome to Technical Communication for Unity Developers. Before we begin, we'll introduce ourselves. So who are we and what do we know about technical communication? My name is Kerry Turner and I work as an engineer on Unity's enterprise support team. As part of my job, I visit the studios of some of Unity's biggest customers, and I spend 2 days doing a technical deep dive into their projects with a focus on performance optimization. While I'm conducting this review, I take a bunch of notes, and I take these back to the office, and I produce a report for the customer based on what I've seen. These reports are usually about 8,000 words long, and I usually write about 2 of these a month. Prior to that, I wrote tutorials for Unity. I wrote the performance optimization tutorials on the Unity Learn site, and I wrote the interactive tutorials, the very first thing you see when you open Unity for the first time. In addition to that, I give a bunch of talks like this, or very quick plug for my talk tomorrow, which is real-world performance optimization, talking about performance tips from my job. All of this is to say, I have a lot of experience communicating technical information to people.
Hi, I'm Siobhan Gibson. I work on the documentation team at Unity as a technical writer and editor. So my main job is to collect information from Unity's developers about new features and new updates to the engine itself, and to turn that information into Unity's technical documentation. So what you read in the user manual and the scripting reference, and also the release notes and other technical resources that you've probably used for Unity before. I also act as an internal documentation consultant for Unity's development teams, so I'll visit the teams and teach them how to produce more helpful technical resources for users and for each other. And I produce writing guides and resources for the whole company. I work with the development teams, our QA engineers, support, content teams, community management, pretty much anyone who's engaging and talking to our customers about technical information. And a lot of what we'll talk about today is information that's in those resources. So, let's talk about what you'll learn from us today. We'll start with what technical communication is and why it's important, not just in general, but also for very specific roles within your studio or your team. Next, we'll talk about how to be a good technical communicator. So we'll go over the foundations of technical writing, including the key principles underpinning everything you need to bear in mind, and a recommended technical communication workflow based on how we work at Unity. We'll also include some advanced tips and recommendations based on our combined experience for those of you who want to know how to go from being a good technical writer to a great technical writer or communicator. What we won't cover today is specific English writing tips. You'll be happy to hear this isn't an English lesson. It's a high-level overview of technical communication concepts and best practices. So the advice that we give you should be transferable in whichever language you're communicating in.
Okay, so what is technical communication? This is not a trick question, it's communicating technical information. When do we use technical communication? You might initially think of the things that Siobhan and I described as part of our work, so writing a report or a tutorial or some documentation. But it's much, much wider than that. If you're working on a game or a piece of software, technical communication happens all the time at every single stage of your project. And throughout your whole organization. So your technical design document or your game design document, the very first blueprints for your game, that is technical communication. If you are emailing a colleague, like maybe letting an artist know how your project's set up, that's technical communication. Commenting your code or you're reporting a bug, that's the same. Later in your game's life cycle, if you're promoting it on social media and you want to talk in depth about the development of it, or if you're providing support for your game, or if you're giving a talk like this, all of this is technical communication. So it's not just documentation. As you can see, this happens throughout the entire life cycle of your game, from first design all the way to well after your game has been completed. It's a vital skill when working in software.
So to demonstrate that, let's look at some of the specific scenarios where you might benefit from good technical communication skills. Firstly, kind of most importantly, if you're making or releasing anything technical, games, assets, hardware, people they can use the things that you make if you can communicate with them about how it works. Users want to be able to find information quickly so they can get stuck in and figure out what they can do with what you've made. If you're promoting something, it's the same deal. It lets people know what they'll be capable of doing, and it allows you to promote the technical features in a way that works best for your target audience. If you're writing documentation, good docs and good tutorials reduce the load on your customer support teams. It means that your users can find the answers themselves rather than sending you support tickets. If you're filing a bug report, clear communication helps you avoid too much back and forth, and it helps you get your bug solved quickly. If you're talking to your colleagues, same again, good communication means clearer conversations and fewer misunderstandings or guesswork, so you can both get the solution you need quickly. And the same applies to when you're talking about customers. There's an added benefit when talking to customers as well, that being able to clearly communicate technical information with your customers gives them much more faith in you and your ability to help them with their problems, and it allows you to build much better relationships with them as a result.
Before we go any further, I would like to clear up two very common misconceptions about technical communication. So the first misconception is that technical communication is all about knowledge. That if you know enough about the thing you're communicating about, that's all you need to get started. Often you might think, say if you've developed a feature, that's all you need to be good at communicating about that feature. And this is incorrect. As Siobhan knows, in the old days, the Unity manual was written entirely by the developers. A developer would create a feature, write some docs for it, and those docs would go live immediately with varying results. I think you can still see some of the old ones on the site now. Yeah. Some of them are great. Some of them are not great. Being a subject matter expert does not make you great at communicating that information. Knowing your subject matter helps, but you don't actually need to know that much at all to be able to communicate technical information well. We'll talk more about that later. The second common misconception is kind of the opposite. That's the idea that technical communication is all about writing skills. And I often see sort of the opposite concern with that. People worry that because maybe they don't enjoy writing much, or they didn't do very well at it at school, or perhaps they're working in a second language, that because they don't have great writing skills, they're not going to be good at technical communication. And that's also incorrect. The truth is that technical communication is a skill in its own right. You don't have to be a great writer to do this well at all. You don't need to know a lot about the subject that you're communicating about to do this well. The opposite's true. You can be a great writer and know a lot about it and still be bad at technical communication, because it is a separate skill to both of these things. As with any skill, you can practice it and you can get better at it. And luckily for you, we have created a guide based on the work that we do every day to help you learn to be a good technical communicator, no matter where you're starting from. If you follow the steps that we're going to teach you in the rest of this session, you will produce good technical communication. Maybe not the best in the world, can't promise to make you a terrific writer, but you will produce good technical communication that does its job. And the more you practice, the better you'll get at it, the more it'll become a natural skill for you. You won't need to follow this workflow every time, you'll just get good at this. So let's start with the foundation of our guide, the 3 principles of technical communication.
So, the 3 key principles of any technical communication are accuracy, clarity, and conciseness. And each of those is important for a different reason. Accuracy is the most obvious. If your user has the wrong information or they don't have all the information, they can't use it. When we talk about accuracy, we also mean completeness, and we also mean precision. The information you provide needs to be correct and complete. Clarity is equally important, because if the user has the information, but it doesn't make sense to them, they might as well not have it at all, and they still can't use it. When information isn't presented clearly or it's presented for the wrong audience, the reader can misunderstand it, or they might give up on it, or they might end up feeling alienated or feel like the concept is actually more complicated than it really is. The information you provide needs to make sense to your audience. Conciseness is perhaps the least considered of the 3 principles, but often the most challenging, especially when you're talking about complicated technical concepts. But it's just as important as the other 2, and the reason for that is that readers generally, when they are reading technical information, tend to be very task-oriented. They will look for the specific piece of information they want and skim everything else. So the information you provide needs to be easy to find.
This slide here is basically your cheat sheet for being good at technical communication. If you remember literally nothing else from this talk, please just remember this one, because this is enough to be kind of decent at it, these 3 points here. Basically, ask yourself, is my work accurate? Is it clear? Is it concise? And if the answer to all these 3 is yes, then it's kind of decent. It's doing its job. Now, you may have noticed that accurate has a fixed meaning. Something's either accurate or not. And concise is fairly clear to understand as well. Just say things in fewer words, or as few words as makes sense. But clear doesn't really have a fixed meaning. It's not obvious who we're talking about making things clear for. So how do you know when your work is clear? We will cover that in the next step. But for now, just remember these 3 key principles.
So let's apply those with this example. Delamping. Apply levo-rotatory force to the incandescent lamp until it is separate from the Edison screw chamber. Now, you might be able to figure out what this is trying to tell you, but only if you had some fairly specific knowledge and a fairly good grasp of the English language. It uses some very obscure terminology, and it's not even immediately clear which parts of this sentence are relevant and which aren't. So let's take a look at how we could rewrite that with these principles in mind.
Okay, to remove a light bulb, twist the bulb counterclockwise until it comes away from the socket. That is the same information rewritten. And you'll notice it's just as accurate as it was before. The first one was accurate. It's about as concise. There's roughly the same number of words there. But it's suddenly clearer. And this is sort of what I was warning about earlier, where some people think that subject matter knowledge is the be-all and end-all, this can be the downside of having too much of a reliance on your subject matter knowledge. The person who wrote this forgot what it was like not to have that knowledge for their audience.
Okay, so we've covered the three main principles: accuracy, clarity, and conciseness. And now we're going to take you through the workflow that we use at Unity to make sure that all of our technical communications adhere to those principles. So these steps are drawn from how we write and also from general best practice for writing anything. So you start by defining your purpose and your audience, literally what you want to say and who you want to say it to. You gather the information you need, you write a first draft, and then you edit and proofread. We're going to take you through each of these steps in detail, and for each one, we'll tell you what you need to do and when you know you're done and that it's time to move on to the next step. You should try to go through these steps whenever you're communicating technical information. It's good practice, and the more you keep it in the back of your mind, it doesn't need to be a super formal process. You know, we know that you're not going to do this for every single Slack message you send or email you fire off. But if you have it in the back of your mind, you will slowly develop your technical communication skills, and it will become habit. So let's start with the first step.
Okay, step one. We begin by defining our purpose and our audience. This simply means asking, what information am I trying to communicate, and to whom? Doing this, crucially, helps you define what clear means, because you now know that it means clear for that audience. That's how we'll work out whether our writing is sufficiently clear as we go through the steps. Here's an example from some of my own work. Both are descriptions of garbage collection in Unity, in managed code. And the first is from a tutorial that I wrote for beginner to intermediate users who are new to the subject of garbage collection. That reads, when our game runs, it uses memory to store data. When this data is no longer needed, the memory that stored that data is freed up so that it can be reused. Garbage is the term for memory that has been set aside to store data, but is no longer in use. Garbage collection is the name of the process that makes that memory available again for reuse. The second example is some writing on the same subject as part of a report that I prepared for a customer discussing garbage collection issues in their game. And that reads, the game generates up to 20 kilobytes of garbage per frame, resulting in frequent garbage collections. So in the first example, you can see I define a lot of terms, and I use simple language, and I explain what's going on at each stage. I explain the why of things. This is because my audience are beginners, and for this message to be clear to them, I need to introduce new concepts and new words as I go. In the second example, I know that my audience are expert Unity developers, and they're already familiar with these terms and ideas. I don't need to define them. I can be much more concise while still being confident that this is clear for my audience. So, stage one. When do you know that it's time to move on? When are you done with stage one and ready to move on to stage two? You ask yourself these questions. So the purpose and audience that you've defined, are they accurate? Have you included all of the information that you want to communicate? And have you definitely got every member of the audience included? And the second question there is, do you understand how to be clear for your audience? So just really thinking about who that audience is and what their needs are. And if you can answer yes to both of these questions, then it's time to move on to stage two of the workflow.
Okay, so now you know what you're trying to communicate and who you're communicating it to. So now you can start gathering the information you need. Of the 3 principles, this step is mainly focused on accuracy, and as part of that, completeness. If you're the developer or the subject matter expert, you can skip some of this stage because you'll probably be really familiar with the subject matter already. But it is still good to think about where you could get extra information. For example, if you have testers or users currently using the thing that you're trying to write about, then talk to them and find out whether they have any input or anything that maybe isn't included in your existing resources. If you're not the developer or you're not an expert on the subject matter, this step is crucial. When you're researching, we recommend you collect as much information as possible from as many different sources as possible. With all technical communication, you'll often find that you need to gather reams and reams and reams of information to write one accurate sentence that is also clear and concise. So talk to developers and QA engineers, find out what your testers and your users are saying, either by talking to them directly or by going to community spaces like forums and finding out what people are currently getting stuck on. If you can get a demo of the thing that you're writing about, that's even better, because then you can explore it yourself. When you're gathering information and you're speaking to your various sources, whether they're developers or users, it's good practice to keep asking questions. Even if you think you know the answer to those questions, you have to make yourself look a bit dim sometimes. The reason we do this is to make sure that your understanding is actually accurate and that you haven't missed anything. So to make sure your information is complete, sometimes you can ask a developer one question and they'll give you 5 answers. And that's immediately more information that you can include. It's also important at this stage because when you're gathering information, you are advocating for your end user, your reader. You need to think about what information they will need and what questions they will have based on the information you've already gathered. So it's good practice to keep looking and think about whether there's extra information you can include to help them. So when do we move on from this stage? Well, these are the 2 questions to ask yourself. Is the information that you've gathered accurate and complete? And is the information you've gathered clear enough for your audience, as you defined in the previous step? So let's take an example of when you might do this and say you're writing a tutorial. You can make sure that it's accurate by making sure you've spoken to multiple people, read multiple sources, tested the tutorial workflow yourself to make sure you understand it, and maybe found out from other people whether they have better practices. And you can make sure it's clear enough by thinking again about who your audience is and whether they're likely to understand the information that you've gathered. So for tutorials specifically, your audience is usually someone who's never done this before and is probably engaging with at least some of the subject matter for the first time. So a way that you could do extra research here is to look at other similar levels of tutorials for beginners and find out whether there is information that you could expand upon or explain in more detail. When you've collected enough information that the answer to both of these questions is yes, then you can move on to the next stage.
Okay, stage 3, write a draft. If you've ever written an essay before, you've probably had to write a draft first. A draft is a rough version of your message. And the first thing you should do is create what's called a first draft, which is the very roughest version of your message. It's like you're practicing how you're going to deliver the information. And it's for your eyes only, and it's usually pretty bad, and that's fine. That's the idea of it. The point of a first draft is just to get all of the information down, and then you can start improving it. I find it helpful when I'm writing something longer, like a tutorial or a report, to write the first draft as quickly as possible, especially if that means it's terrible, to just absolutely rush through it and get something there that I can iterate on. For me, the blank page is the hardest bit of writing anything at all, so anything I can do to get through that bit quickly is good. You'll find, if you're writing as quickly as possible, that you're missing information. It's really common to get halfway through a sentence and be like, oh, yeah, actually, I don't know how much CPU that uses, or, oh, I don't know the name of that function. At this stage, just leave yourself a note there. Leave a to-do. Don't go and research it and come back to it. You'll break your flow. Leave missing information in there and leave horrible sentences in there. Write something absolutely unreadable if you have to, and then put a note saying, come back to this. The most important thing is to keep your flow going at this stage. If you're not used to drafting, or you're new to improving your technical communication skills, it would be helpful, I think, to write what you would normally write. Let's say it's a blog post. Write what you would normally write, and then instead of hitting send, call that your first draft. That's a good way to get into this habit of drafting. So once you've got your first draft, written either badly or just by taking what you were going to send anyway, you then need to rework it until you have what's called a final draft. A final draft is where all of the information is there and it's in the right order, and it still doesn't matter if the writing's horrible. That's still totally fine. So what you do is you take your first draft, you go through, fill in any missing information or any bits that you said you'd get back to, take a break, and then look at the logical flow of the content. So if you're writing a blog post and it starts on topic A, then goes to topic B, then back to topic A again, that will need reordering. You want a smooth, logical flow throughout. When you have all of the information in there with no to-dos left, and it's in a smooth, logical order, that's great. That's when you have your final draft. I've got a couple of real quick examples here. So that's just first draft, totally fine to leave some missing information in there. I forgot the name of the button as I was going and didn't want to break my flow writing it. That's fine. Final draft, put the name of the button back in. This is an example of drafting to reorder the flow of information. So in this case, say you're writing a bug report. First draft, the application crashed. The last thing I saw before the crash was a pop-up saying error 234. Oh, and this happened when I clicked on the start button. Take a break, come back to it, and realize that's not in an order that's helpful and clear for your audience. In the case of a bug report, the helpful and clear and logical order is to describe the steps in the order that the person can reproduce them. So it's the same information in a more logical, helpful order. I clicked on the start button. I saw a pop-up saying error 234. The application then crashed. So when to move on from this stage? How do you know that your final draft is ready for stage 4? This one's pretty easy. Again, it's this idea of accuracy and clarity. Ask yourself, is all of the content here accurate? Yes. And is the structure clear? Again, not the writing. The writing can still be extremely horrible. If the answer to both of these is yes, great. You are ready to move on to stage 4.
So the final step is editing, which is the main part of my day-to-day job. Editing is where you transform your draft document into your user-facing document. So most of the work here is focused on clarity and conciseness, where most of what we've done so far is focused on accuracy and completeness. This is where we really hone in on the other 2 principles that we spoke about. Most of the work here is focused on reorganizing information, condensing information, and rewriting information. And before I start talking about it in more detail, I want to clear up a common misconception about editing, which is that a lot of people think that editing is primarily focused on fixing spelling and grammar. Fixing spelling and grammar is a really important part of editing. It comes under the name proofreading. But it's a relatively small part that comes in at the end. And that is the part that you generally do need a good writer for if you're not confident in your own writing abilities. Editing is something you can do yourself. It's best practice to have somebody else do it because they can put a fresh pair of eyes on what you've written and tell you where there's missing information or confusing information. But if that's not an option, self-editing is still better than no editing. So let's start with editing for clarity and some things we can do. The first is to use audience-appropriate language. Thinking about your audience has been a theme of this whole talk. So think about the audience that you defined earlier and use the language that you know your audience will understand. So if, like me, you're usually writing for a broad range of users, try to avoid advanced technical terminology. You know that you will have expert users reading this, but you also know you will have beginner users reading this. And we always tend to try to aim for the beginner end, because that means that everyone else will naturally understand what's in that content. If, like Kerry, you're writing for a more specialized audience, you can be a little bit more relaxed about the terminology you use. You can speak to them on their level, but it's still important to remember not to make too many assumptions about what they might know outside of their specialization. For example, if you're talking to your graphics QA, you still might need to give them a few beginner nudges if you're talking to them about the networking in your game, for example. The second key point is to be consistent. And in this context, we mean consistency in the way that you write and the terminology that you use. So the example we always give is the word game object. Game object has a defined specific meaning in Unity, and if you're talking about a game object, you should always use the word game object, not object or actor or anything from other software that could be misinterpreted. You can also use this step to make sure that your communications match your user interface. So make sure that the words you're using, if you're referring to specific settings or buttons, make sure you're actually using what your reader will see reproduced in the software that you're talking about. Consistency is a surprisingly big part of gaining your reader's trust and establishing yourself as a valuable source of information. At Unity, we use a writing style guide to ensure that, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. The final key here is to avoid ambiguity, which is obvious on a slide about clarity, but it's really true that technical communication is only useful when it is precise and exact. So think about whether the information you're providing could be misinterpreted. Think about how it could be misinterpreted. Think about how likely it is to be misinterpreted, and rewrite until there is almost no risk, ideally no risk at all, of misinterpretation.
So here's a quick example of editing for clarity. This is from an older version of the scripting API documentation for the property audio clip playable is playing. The old content here simply said, is the audio clip currently playing? If you're familiar with the scripting API, or you're familiar with this component, or reasonably familiar with Unity in general, you can probably work out what this means. But if you're a beginner, it's not clear, and it's not telling you anything. In fact, it seems to be asking you something. It's not clear at all. So, after editing for clarity, this content now says, use this property to check whether the audio clip is currently playing. Returns true if it is playing, or false if it is not. This tells the user what the property's for more clearly, but it also gives some additional information. It tells you what it does under different conditions. So there's no ambiguity at all about this information now.
Okay, so let's move on to editing for conciseness. The key point here is to remember the purpose of your content. Remember what it is you're actually trying to say. When you've gathered all that information, it's really tempting to include all of it. and to put in extra information or anecdotes or the history of all the concepts involved or hypothetical situations. But most of those really aren't helpful. Try to remember what specific piece of information you're trying to convey and cut out everything else. The second key point is to lead with the most important information. Again, this comes back to what I was saying earlier about how readers tend to be task-oriented. They'll scan the beginnings of paragraphs and sentences to find the information that they need. So you can help them out by making sure that the way you write front-loads the sentences so that they can act as good indicators of the information. Finally, don't write too much. It's really easy to write 100 words about something that could be explained with one sentence. We'll demonstrate how that can dilute your information in this next example.
Okay, an example here of editing for conciseness. This example comes from some draft documentation that was being worked on recently within Unity. And the before here reads, if you happen to know how to handle the correct number of threads that your system can handle and avoid bugs caused by race conditions, you can perform multiple tasks at once that can run for a long time. Unfortunately, when you're developing a game, this is rarely the case. Usually, you have a huge number of small things to do. Okay, this is long, and a lot of it, when you look at it, is padding. In fact, almost all of it is about something that isn't the case. This isn't relevant information. We're talking about what could happen and isn't happening. So, rewritten for conciseness here, the same information turns out to just be the final sentence of that first example. Game development code usually contains multiple small tasks and instructions. That was the actual information from that whole first paragraph. Also note that the first example there is 61 words, and the revised version is 10 words. When you're writing documentation or tutorials, anything like that, you're making extra work for yourself when you pad. You're making extra work editing, localizing, maintaining it. All of this is work you don't need to be doing. And the user will understand it better when it's simple. So when is it time to move on from the editing stage and actually hit send on your blog post, tutorial, documentation, email, whatever it is? That is up to you at this point. Once you've been through this workflow and you've been applying the 3 principles at every stage, you should by now have something that's in reasonably good shape. And you should be able to tell the difference between something that's in good shape and isn't. So simply look at your work and ask those 3 questions we told you about right at the start. Is it accurate? Is it clear for my audience? And is it concise? And if the answer is yes, then great, you have produced a solid and good piece of technical communication. Well done.
Okay, so that's how you become a good technical communicator. So how do you become a great technical communicator? We're going to take you through just a few of the things that we do at Unity to just improve the quality of all of our docs, and actually all of our technical communications. So we use peer review, we use a style guide, and we use our soft skills. And I'll talk about what each one of those is. So peer review. If you're not familiar with the term, peer review is when somebody else checks your work, quite simply. If you already experienced this in having your code reviewed or your design reviewed, this works exactly the same way. It's just important to have somebody else pass a sense check over your work. So you should speak to the developers or the subject matter experts to make sure that what you've produced is actually accurate and that it's complete. And you should try to get users or just get some test readers to look through it for clarity and conciseness. When you're doing this, really invite feedback and dig into that feedback. Don't just ask, does it make sense? Ask, what didn't you understand? Where did you get stuck? Where did you feel like you were guessing at what I was trying to tell you? And how could it have been clearer? The second tip is to use a style guide. If you're not familiar with style guides, it's essentially a set of standards. So again, you might be familiar with this already through using code standards or design standards. This is very much the same principle. You don't necessarily need to write your own style guide from scratch. At Unity, we use Microsoft's writing style guide, which is excellent, and it's online and it's free, which is amazing. So this acts as a reference guide for writing for the whole company. And it means that everybody has access to basic writing guidelines. What we then do on the documentation team is maintain an internal Unity-specific style guide, which helps us keep track of our Unity-specific terminology. So, for example, terms like prefab or asset in Unity are standardized terms. They always mean a specific thing. So we use this style guide to determine when to use those words. A style guide also helps us keep track of some of the more challenging aspects of writing about technology, like when we need to know whether we need to write runtime, runtime, or runtime. And the final tip is to use your soft skills. So if you're not familiar with the term soft skills, it's described as attributes that make it easier for you to interact effectively with other people. It's basically interpersonal and social skills, and they are essential for any kind of communication. Soft skills are normally seen as the opposite of hard skills, which are quantifiable skills like programming or maths or writing. Most, if not all, communication is ultimately about empathy. Understanding the person you're talking to, putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about how they're experiencing the information you're giving them and how you can reach a mutual understanding with that person. It's not a one-way process. Technical communication is no different to this. You can't only apply logic to this task. You are ultimately a person communicating with another person. And to be a great technical writer, you need to remember that good communication happens when all parties understand each other and the understanding goes in all directions. It's important for your reader to understand you, but the more you think about and understand your reader, the better you'll be able to communicate with them.
Okay, we're just about to wrap up now, so I'll super quickly recap what we've covered today. So, how to be a good technical communicator. You've got your 3 principles there, and just follow that workflow and keep applying those principles. And even if you're starting from scratch, you will produce pretty decent, good technical communication. You can do it. If you want to produce great technical communication, check out those advanced tips. So start inviting peer review, look up the Microsoft Style Guide for an example of how you might build your own style guide, and develop your soft skills and communicate with other humans.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. We don't have time for questions, I'm afraid, but if anybody does have any questions resulting from this talk, please do drop us a line. We're happy to get back to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.